I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal story. What is a disability? The medical and social models of disability, disability as diversity, ableism and discrimination, disability in healthcare, disability disparities, disabled physicians, the benefits of doctors with disabilities, creative inclusion, and lastly, my organization, the Stanford Medicine Abilities Coalition. So this is me in 2003. I like to ride my bike around San Francisco. I was also a road racer. It was extremely fun. Stopped being fun on January 5th, 2003, when I got in an accident and got paralyzed from the neck down. I was transferred from my hospital, San Francisco General, where I was being taken care of by all my friends, down to Santa Clara Valley Spinal Cord Injury Rehab Center. And this was me in rehab. This was actually an improvement, sitting up in a chair and using a chin drive to drive around. But you can see that my hands are like strapped down to my side. And so this was, I have to confess, pretty awful. Don't be fooled by the smiley face and the cookie bouquet. But fortunately, for me, the accident wasn't so severe that I wouldn't recover. And so over time, and after a lot of therapy, I eventually regained the ability to walk. And I retrained in radiology at Stanford. Once I couldn't do the procedures in GI, it wasn't that interesting to me anymore. So now I'm a GI radiologist, and I read CAT scans and x-rays and ultrasounds and MRIs of mostly people with digestive diseases. And I zip around on my Segway. And I've been on the faculty at Stanford since 2009. I was the associate residency program director in radiology until 2017. And then I founded SMAC in 2018 to advocate for people with disabilities, not just my colleagues and workers, co-workers, but also for patients with disabilities. So just a little bit of basic information for those of you who might be less familiar with disability. Disability is a physical or mental condition that limits a person's movements, senses, or activities, or a disadvantage or handicap, especially one imposed or recognized by the law. So we're talking about a wide variety of conditions, which I'll talk about later, but a spinal cord injury and paralysis definitely counts. The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990 and was landmark legislation protecting people with disabilities from discrimination. And the ADA definition is of a person with a disability is someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. This includes people who have a record of such an impairment, even if they do not currently have a disability. So, the definition through the law, especially after it was amended in 2008, is very inclusive, and many conditions that you might not even consider to be disabling count as disabilities if they limit some aspect of your life. So for years and years, the predominant model of understanding disability was the medical model, focused on impairments, the need for help, and searches for cure and alleviation of suffering, assumed that people with disabilities lacked decision-making capacity. They were institutionalized and often, sterilized even during the eugenics movement. They're thought of as objects of charities. Object of charity, they must fit into society. And then, of course, they must rise above and conquer. And this medical model centers the problem on the individual. So, but now people use different models to understand disability. And one of these is the social model. And the social model focuses on the environment and says the person is disabled by their environment and its barriers. And that disabled people are normal and should have equal rights. They should have autonomy, choice, and free and informed consent. They should be supported. And instead of asking the people with disability to adjust to society, the society should adjust to them. And so this is a very different way of looking at disability. There are combined models also, which it doesn't have to be one or the other. The person can have a problem that is theirs alone, but then you also take in consideration their context and the barriers of society. So what about disability as diversity? Well, when I stopped being the program director, associate program director in radiology, I was looking around for things to do. I'd always been interested in diversity. I went to Santa Clara University, and they have a focus on social justice. I grew up in a low-income community in Stockton, California. So I was attuned to civil rights and social justice. And so I started looking around to get involved with diversity initiatives. And I noticed that, that disability wasn't being represented very well. I think, as you can see in this top left picture, that has lots of men and women of various races and ethnicities. And, I think that advocating for other underrepresented people in medicine is very important. And I have no qualms about that, but disabled people need to be included also. This infographic here from my own radiology diversity initiative made me happy that they were including people with disabilities. But when I looked at the committee members, I noticed that there wasn't somebody with a disability representing those constituents. And so I decided to be that person. And that's kind of like a theme of my advocacy, I would say, is continuous inviting myself to different things. So and this has been a real learning experience for me. I'm not a disability scholar. I wasn't really well versed in disability. I didn't even consider myself actually to be disabled. I could say I have a disability, but the label disabled to me had like a negative connotation. And so, and also just from the legal aspect, when I would think about being disabled, I felt like that means somebody who cannot work. And because I work full-time as a physician, I didn't consider myself to be disabled. And it's been a journey for me to overcome my own internal ableism, to finally, through finding a community, through educating myself, consider myself to be disabled, and with a capital D, as in disabled and proud. So there are lots of negative messages about people with disabilities in the media that sort of fuel continued ableism. For those of you who like movies, you can say, what do these films have in common? Me Before You, $1 Million Baby, See Inside, whose life is it anyways? Well, in addition to having non-disabled actors play disabled people, which is only the minor problem, these films all deal with assisted suicide of people with disabilities, saying, basically sending the message that killing disabled people is okay because they're a burden and they're suffering. And so assisted suicide seems reasonable and rational. But, if you ask people with disabilities if they want to die, I would say the overwhelming majority do not. People have a real drive to survive. People adjust. I would have thought before my spinal cord injury that I would rather be dead than paralyzed. But yet here I am, and I have a happy and full life with a family and friends. And, I like being on planet Earth. And most disabled people feel the same way. If you ask doctors about the quality of life of people with disabilities, the doctors consistently underestimate the quality of life that people have. And this is a real problem because, I have a personal fear sometimes if I go into the hospital, they're going to see me, paralyzed and unable to move. This actually happened to me a couple years ago when I had sepsis and altered mental status, and I was completely out of it. And the doctors, they weren't that great about understanding that I wasn't like this all the time, and like they saw this person in front of them who was paralyzed and having like all these symptoms, and it was really hard for them to get their head around the fact that I was a faculty radiologist and their colleague. And so I feel like I might have to put a tattoo of full code on my chest pretty soon so that people don't assume that I would be okay with non-aggressive interventions. Because if I do get sick and in the hospital, I want them to do everything to save me so I can hang out longer with my wife and kid. Well, for those of you out there who don't have a disability, you may be asking yourselves, how does this affect me? There's a great book called A Disability History of the United States, and it talks about the intersections of ableism with other isms. And so she says, when disability is construed as deficiency and dependency, it's the opposite of American ideals of independence and autonomy. And she goes on to say, thus, disability has served as an effective weapon in contests over power and ideology. For example, at varying times, African Americans, immigrants, gays and lesbians, poor people and women have been defined categorically as defective citizens incapable of full civic participation. So, these sorts of arguments about like that some groups are of less sound mind and body have been used to, not allow people to be citizens, not to be able to vote, to be discriminated against. It's more complicated. I mean, like, you can't equate racism and ableism. They're not identical, but they share qualities. They share like the tactics of oppression and exclusion. If you're still not convinced, because you don't have a disability, you might want to say that you don't have a disability yet, because if you live long enough, you probably will acquire one. So this is just a part of normal life. And the more we talk about it and recognize it, and then normalize this sort of acceptance and help-seeking behavior and show consideration to one another, we can decrease ableism and make a better environment. So, I never thought I would be in a wheelchair ever in a million years. I felt very cheated by the fact that I got paralyzed, but yet, this is a normal part of life and happens to a lot of people. And the Institute of Medicine even says if one considers people who now have disabilities, people who are likely to develop disabilities in the future, and people who are or will be affected by the disabilities of family members or others close to them, then disability affects today or will affect tomorrow the lives of most Americans. Clearly, disability is not a minority issue. So across the lifespan, again, almost everybody encounters it at some point. In fact, the WHO says disability is virtually a universal phenomenon and a natural feature of the human condition. Within disability, there is a lot of diversity. They have mobility. We talk about being very open in my group, to accepting any and all kinds of disability. We take a very broad view. We don't want to exclude anybody. It's basically any physical or mental condition that can affect your life. This includes visible and invisible disabilities. So my disability is very visible as a mobility, but many people, in fact, most people in medicine with disabilities have invisible ones, such as learning disabilities, chronic health conditions like Crohn's disease, ADHD, psychological disabilities like depression or anxiety, deaf or hard of hearing, visual, autism spectrum disorders. These are all, groups within the umbrella of disability. Now, what about disability in healthcare? Let's talk about our patients and our community. The health of our disabled countrymen is not as good as our non-disabled population. They're more likely to be unemployed, victims of violent crime, to suffer from cardiovascular disease earlier in life, to be obese, to smoke, to engage in no leisure time activity, to be up to date and current with their mammogram and other screening tests, and more likely to not receive health care due to cost. And so, this is a real problem, and we need to take a hard look at this and figure out how to address these issues. So what about ourselves, disability in healthcare, and our medical community? So people with disabilities are the largest minority in America. The estimates are between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 people. But they're completely underrepresented in healthcare. The last publication on this estimated that it's 4.6% of medical students who have disclosed a disability. This is likely underreported because a lot of people don't disclose, but clearly there are barriers to entry into the field, and so we are not represented in the same proportions as in the general population, just like other underrepresented groups, whether they be African American or Latino or LGBTQ, they're all underrepresented compared to the population. We're working at Stanford to change this, and I applaud Iris Gibbs, our Dean of Admissions, for making this year's class one of the most diverse in history. I believe 30% of the class or more is a member of an underrepresented group. So what are the barriers? There's this culture of strength in medicine, especially in med schools and residency programs, where doctors are expected to tolerate a lot of suffering, the likes of which other professions do not. And so we're expected to work long shifts without complaining, to work overnight, to work weekends. We're trained to not ask for anything, to be fast and efficient. We're not given enough time for self-care, and we're proud of it. We like to talk about how busy we are, how little we sleep, how few days off we have. And instead of admiring these factors in people, we should be alarmed because, this has a direct negative effect on people's wellness and contributes to the high rates of suicide and depression and burnout we see in medicine. So this culture of strength doesn't benefit anyone, this idea of the superhero physician. Now, so there have been articles written about the culture of strength in medicine. This one came out in New England Journal from one of my mentees, Suchi Rastogi, where talks about the discrimination that she suffered on the wards as a person with a disability. And she says, despite an accommodation to limit time on my feet, I was expected to climb stairs instead of taking elevators. When I went home early, in keeping with my pre-approved disability-related working hours accommodations, authority figures shamed me for leaving. So these sorts of experiences definitely are not inviting. But we are here, there's a ton of us in medicine. These are just some of the people that you see if you Google doctors with disabilities. And we have grit. We have a unique perspective on life and health that's just invaluable when trying to improve care. I've been on both sides of the curtain, and I know what it's like intimately to be a doctor and patient. I feel like that gives me insight that others don't have. There's another benefit to including people with disabilities in medicine, and this is called the upward spiral of positive or informed information about people with disabilities, where when you interact with a student or another professional with a disability, that increases your awareness about disability. It lowers your stereotyping and reduces assumptions. And that sort of new attitude that people have towards their colleagues with disabilities translates into more informed patient care of those with disabilities. And ultimately, we hope will reduce healthcare disparities that are caused by stereotype and stigma. Let's talk a little bit about creative inclusion and my role. My Stanford radiology experience, this is my program director. She was open-minded and flexible, and she understood her latitudes and the program's requirement to make modifications for me in my program, such as no overnight call and being exempt from doing procedures. She saw the benefit of having somebody with a disability in the program, and she made modifications to be welcoming. I also have a volunteer program where pre-med students shadow me and assist me at the same time. And of course, my residency program colleagues were also instrumental in helping and getting me through. So it took a village. It continues to take a village. Unfortunately, my volunteer program is on hiatus now because volunteers aren't allowed back in the hospital because of COVID. And so I've been working from home this whole time, but now I'm kind of stuck at home because I don't have my assistants at the hospital. So hopefully that will change soon. So what about you guys? What about application to medical school if you have a disability? Well, disability is increasingly recognized as diversity. Diversity, of course, itself is becoming more and more important, especially in the last year after George Floyd's murder. So I would say to apply broadly, but also strategically. When you look online for schools, look for messages about accommodations and diversity. You know, some schools will say, like, if you need accommodations in your interview, let us know, or we welcome people with disabilities and we will provide reasonable accommodations. These sort of messages are a clue to an institution possibly being more open. I would write a candid personal statement. If disability is a big part of your identity, then I would include it. You don't want to show up at a school and have a disability, and that place is not really open to disability or making accommodations. You want to find that out before you start, not after. And then there's always a question of whether or not to disclose your disability. And I would say that I would encourage people to disclose. I think that people are looking for the journey traveled, and people with disabilities have a unique journey that they have traveled and have had to be creative in their studies and in their life. And so I would say that it's important to disclose. Our Dean of Admissions actually put this message on our medical school admissions site, that we support and encourage applicants with a range of abilities and disabilities, including disabilities that are not immediately apparent. There are other schools that have similar messages, like UCSF and Case Western. These are the kind of messages you want to look for schools that are open. So what are things that schools can do for you? You may think, well, it's not really possible to accommodate me, but there are a range of accommodations. And I won't go through all of these, but they include scheduling, testing, physical assistance, modified approaches to procedures, assistive technology, communication, and hopefully disability resource providers at the school can help you with these things. There are benefits to these accommodations that are so important. I mean, for you as a learner, to have equity with your peers, accommodations aren't special treatment. They are a right. They're meant to level the playing field, not to give unfair advantages to other people. And so accommodations for people with disabilities levels the playing field and puts you on equal footing. You want to put in your best performance, and if your best performance includes accommodations or would be facilitated by them, that's very important for you and will ensure your future success. For the school, it's important to provide accommodations because their graduation rates improve. They have improved retention. They have less disability-related complaints and litigation. And there are new requirements from the NIH that in grant applications that mandate describing your efforts to recruit, retain, and graduate students with disabilities. So this is becoming less and less of an elective thing and is becoming more required. And it's not that hard for the schools. They don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are guides out there that tell them how to do this. And so, I've been just occupied for a long time now with Stanford Medicine Abilities Coalition. It's an amazing group. We're co-hosting a podcast now with Lisa Meeks from the University of Michigan called Docs with Disabilities. We have a mentoring program for medical students with the Society of Physicians with Disabilities. We hold an annual conference on disability in healthcare and medicine. We had over 1,000 attendees from 39 countries, and you can see those videos are on YouTube if you want to see last year's and this year's presentations. And our medical students are creating a national organization for med students with disabilities and chronic illness. And you can read more about this stuff online. So, for me, it's been a long journey to disability pride, from having a lot of internalized ableism to being proud of my disability. And I would encourage those of you with disabilities out there to also be proud. You're not alone. There are other people like you. There are a lot of other people like you, and we need you in medicine. So looking to the future, we just hope that the world will become a more and more accommodating place for people with disabilities, and therefore a better place for everyone. And, if you're interested in more information, you could email us or join our listserv there at the bottom. And that's the last slide.
Hi, sorry, thank you. Dr. Poullos, that was awesome. I think that is such good information for all of our students out there. We did get a comment from somebody. She said, I'm a bit worried about disclosing my disabilities, but I know that the culture is changing to make it less stigmatized. So,
yeah. I mean, it is changing. I think it's really important to be upfront about these things, like I said, because you don't want to end up at the wrong school, a school that's not going to want to accommodate you or work with you. You don't want to end up 2 years in without accommodations, underperforming, and possibly be subject to dismissal or failure. Because if you don't disclose your disability and you get into academic trouble, you can't declare afterwards and say, wait, do over, I have a disability. Well, after 2 years of not doing well in school, it's too late. And so I would say disclose early, disclose often. And if your school doesn't have a group of people focused on disabilities, start one yourself. We have videos on how to do that. But just know that some schools are friendlier than others. Unfortunately, some people don't have a choice where they go to medical school. They might only get into one school. And so, I understand that this is a bit of a privilege issue, a student who has all the grades and research and scores and activities to get into a school that is, of their choosing, that's progressive and open. That may not be the case everywhere. And so, I realize that can be an issue, but, hopefully our message will trickle down to every school.
There's another question for you.
Yeah, that's Samala 86. With med school being so competitive, how do we ensure that those of us who are disabled won't be passed over for someone who isn't? Well, you can't be sure of that. And I'll tell you that, that there are people on admissions committees in this country who would rather not deal with students with disabilities. But there are other people on admissions committees who will see that and say, wow, this is impressive. This person has, dealt with a lot. I hate to use the word overcome, but because it's a little ableist in and of itself. But, for whatever it's worth, sometimes these stories of disabilities are inspiring to others, which I also hate the word inspirational, the I word. But, I think that, there are benefits to these sort of stereotypes sometimes. And if somebody thinks that, you're living with a disability and overcoming that is inspirational and they want you at their school, well, then so be it. When I looked at applications for residency, I would specifically look for African Americans, women, other represented minorities, people from low income backgrounds, people who are first generation, people with disabilities. Like, those are the people that I want in my program, because those people know what it's like to work, and they know what it's like to, they don't have their head in the clouds, and they understand, I think, life more than a lot of other people. Not to say that, white 11th generation Americans don't have these abilities, but, I think diversity makes our teams more powerful. Diversity creates a better environment for everyone. And so, and I know there are other people like me out there who want more diversity in their programs and see disability as part of that. There are lots of, for example, people with autism spectrum disorders or neurodiversity. We're starting to realize the benefit of including those people, because they think differently, they approach problems differently. And so, they can help us solve problems that conventional thinkers may not be able to solve. And the same goes for people with ADHD and other learning disabilities. If you think differently, that's a strength, not a weakness. How do you address colleagues or peers who make comments or demonstrate ableism? Yeah, you have to nip it in the bud. I think, we're starting to realize this with racism and how to be an anti-racist, being an upstander. I find that most people don't, like when they make these sorts of comments, it's not because they're malicious, it's because they just don't know. And so I think it's really important not to attack people for making mistakes, because, a lot of people, I think, are accepting of diversity of all kinds, but they don't know the lingo. And, it's intimidating. I think a lot of people are even intimidated to talk about disability because they don't want to say the wrong thing. And so I think it's important to give people, to cut people some slack and just assume the best. So if somebody says something ableist to me, well, it depends on the degree. If somebody says to me, "Oh, your wife is an angel for being with you and taking care of you," I might not be so nice in my response. But if somebody says, "Oh, so-and-so is confined to a wheelchair," well, I might say actually, so we don't really say that anymore. We usually say someone's a wheelchair user, uses a wheelchair, and they will usually say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know that." because people aren't confined to wheelchairs. They're not like physically sewn on or attached to their bodies. So that's my advice on how to deal with it. It's good to nip it in the bud and to do it in a way, I think, that now if people fight back with you and get nasty about it, well, that's a whole other story too, and you should stick up for yourself. How can social factors be addressed, social and health disparities? Yeah, that's a very good question. So, there's the healthcare system in a lot of ways is inaccessible to people with disabilities. There have been studies that have shown that like up to 30% of doctors' offices can't even accommodate people in wheelchairs. This was done by like calling around to various clinics and saying, like, oh, I have my family member uses a wheelchair and, would need assistance and an accessible exam table, and to a large number of clinics aren't able to accommodate that. People, like, they may not have sign language translators. They may not, have instructions in Braille, or it's poorly equipped, I think, to deal with people with disabilities. So that's one thing that needs to change. People need to ensure that their physical infrastructure and their patient materials are accessible to those with disabilities. They need to make sure that their telehealth or video visit platforms are accessible. And unfortunately, it's often an afterthought. Oh, I didn't think about the fact that we might have some patients who are deaf or can't sit for prolonged periods of time or whatever. So a lot of it is cultural shift. We at Stanford provide, like last June, provided like a message of the month on disability language and disability etiquette. I think that's important. But the factors are similar for other underrepresented groups and minoritized populations, where it's just a lot of it is a question of access, and unfortunately, people with disabilities are disproportionately suffer from poverty and low resources and lack of health insurance. And that's a political issue that needs to be solved on a national level. And I believe we should have universal healthcare insurance so that people aren't bankrupted by their medical bills. So thanks for that question.
I think that's about it. I'm sure we could have many more questions come in and people, keep getting valuable advice from you. But we appreciate your time and you coming on. And how can people reach you if they have any more questions?
Yeah, so the email address is stanfordmedac@stanford.edu.